everyone, welcome back to the Apologetics. So glad you joined us today. Today I'm joined by Joe Schmid of Majesty of Reason. We're going to talk about the Aloneness Argument against Classical Theism. So, Joe, how's it going?
It's going wonderful. I'm really glad to be back on your channel. I really enjoyed our last conversation. That was really fun. And so, yeah, thanks for having me on.
Yeah, no, it's fun, and it's fun keeping up with you and your work and jabbing at Arsenal occasionally and just living life. So this should be a lot of fun.
Yeah, they are. They're not the greatest team ever, but, you know, I'm Arsenal till I die, so.
Well, we'll see how it goes. But for today, we're going to talk about like the Aloneness Argument against Classical Theism and like what all that entails. So to begin, can you just like talk a little bit about like who you are and what you do and then what got you interested in like things like this?
Yeah, so like you said, I'm Joe. I do both popular and scholarly level work in philosophy. So on the scholarly level, I write and publish papers and even books. Let's see. No, yeah, right there. Okay, there's my book, Majesty of Reason, A Short Guide to Critical Thinking and Philosophy. You can find that on Amazon. And also working with some different academic publishers on a different book manuscript on existential inertia and classical theistic proofs. So that's fun stuff. And yeah, just writing, reviewing, and publishing papers. And then on the popular side, I have a YouTube channel, Majesty of Reason. I have fun discussions on there with philosophers of all different stripes on all different kinds of topics, mostly philosophy of religion, but also like metaphysics, philosophy of time. I also go into ethics some. I branch out in a lot of different places. And then I also have a blog on the popular level. So that's by the same name, majestyofreason.wordpress.com. And then what got me interested in classical theism? Well, I grew up a kind of traditional Christian with the kind of traditional classical theistic concept of God. And I've just always been interested in whether or not God exists, firstly, but secondly, if God exists, what is God like? I think that's a really interesting question. And you know, you can investigate that question without even believing in God as well. So it's something that can unite people across a whole host of different perspectives. So really interested in that. And then I guess one final thing before I turn it back to you is that, you know, this argument that we're exploring here, it's not meant to be knocked down or anything like that, right? For most arguments in philosophy, there are going to be ways that you can get out of certain premises or certain things. It might involve biting some bullets, might involve biting some pretty strong bullets. But I don't want to give people the impression that this is some insuperable knockdown, decisive refutation that is irrefutable. Like, we can put that kind of polemics to the side and let's just explore reality together. And let's have the requisite intellectual humility to recognize that our arguments might not be infallible. So, yeah.
Yeah, no, that's super interesting. And I appreciate that. And it's so interesting thinking about like these models of God, at least for me, because like growing up, like it was always like culturally Christian, but like I never knew that they're like different models of God. I thought it was like, oh, well, God's probably triune and like that's it. But like there's like all this like stuff with like classical theism and neoclassical theism and all this fun stuff. So to start off, we're going to talk about like classical theism and the doctrine of divine simplicity. So to start off, what is the doctrine of divine simplicity?
Yeah, so the doctrine of divine simplicity, or like DDS, you can call it that. I'll probably switch between those throughout this discussion. But it's one of the core doctrines or theses or claims of classical theism. And so classical theism is a model of God. What's a model of God? Well, it's basically a way of conceiving or understanding God, God's nature, his character, his relation to the world. So it's a set of unique claims about God's nature and the God-world relation. Other doctrines within classical theism that demarcate it from other views are immutability. So God he has no potential. He's purely actual. He cannot change in any way, shape, or form. He's impassible. So what that means is that he exists in a state of undisturbable blessedness and bliss and happiness, and he cannot be causally affected. And God's also timeless, in addition to being simple. So timeless just means he's outside of time. There's no succession in his life. He doesn't like do one thing and then another. He doesn't think one thing and then another. He doesn't like know one thing and then another, and so on. So those are the four kind of core tenets of classical theism, in addition to divine simplicity. I should say that classical theism has a lot of other theses in common with other models of God. God's perfect. God's radically independent. God's ase. God's necessarily existent. God's a creator and sustainer of all else. Omniscient, omnipotent, blah blah blah. So it's most. They mostly agree with one another on the core, or at least a lot of the core doctrines. But these four distinctive ones kind of demarcate classical theism. Now, I do want to talk about like parsing out this divine simplicity a little bit further. But it basically says that God has no parts. Okay, no physical, no metaphysical, no logical parts at all in God. And that raises the question, right? What is a part? Well, within the classical theistic tradition at large, a part of something let's just call that thing S. So a part of S is some positive ontological item intrinsic to, but distinct from S. Okay, so a positive ontological item, what is that? Well, that's just anything with like being or reality or existence. It's like anything of which it is true that there is that thing, right? Anything of which it is true that there exists that thing. So that's what a positive ontological item is. It might be a property, it might be an accident, it might be a substance, it might be anything of which it is true that there is that thing, okay? And then I also made use of this notion of intrinsicality, right? So what is this intrinsic thing? Well, intrinsic properties and predicates, they characterize things as they are in themselves, right? As they are in and of themselves, and it contrasts with extrinsic properties and predications, which characterize things not as they are in themselves, in and of themselves, but rather how they relate or fail to relate to things outside of them, as it were. So kind of intuitive way is that that you can cast this doctrine of divine simplicity is that all that is in God is God, right? So there's no positive ontological item intrinsic to God that's distinct from him, which just means that everything in God is God. Okay, so that's it's a long-winded way of saying it, but that's the doctrine.
Yeah. No, I think that's a really good way of fleshing it out. So a couple of the important things in your argument are these ideas of like divine creative freedom and then divine omniscience. Did you want to kind of like hash those out? And yeah.
Yeah. So divine creative freedom basically just says that, listen, God is free to create or refrain from creating anything. In other words, for any positive ontological, and this is the classical theistic understanding of it, for any positive ontological item that's distinct from God, right, or any collection of such items, God is free to create that item or collection of items, and he's also free to refrain from creating that item or that collection of items. And so basically, God's free to create or refrain from creating. That's all it says. And this applies to anything distinct from him, anything numerically distinct from him. So secondly, divine omniscience. You asked about that. So that basically just means that necessarily, if some proposition is true, God knows that it's true. Okay, so if it's true that dogs exist, God knows that dogs exist. If it's false that I exist, well, then God knows that it's false that I exist, and so on. So basically, there are a few complications there. You can talk about whether or not future contingents have a truth value and all that stuff, but we don't need to get into that. Omniscience just says God knows everything, and he knows all truths in any possible world in which he exists.
That's super helpful. So like one of the big ideas kind of looking at this argument is the idea that maybe God could choose to live in, say, a world like in a lone world, or he could choose to live in a world like this world, given like the idea of like classical theism. Can you like hash that out and like the idea of like creative freedom and its importance with this argument?
Yeah. So classical theists have pretty unanimously held throughout history that God is indeed free to create and refrain from creating anything. You can find this in pretty much every major classical theistic thinker, pretty much. But in that case, though, right, God is free to create absolutely nothing, right? He is free to choose to exist alone, all by himself, not accompanied by anything else, okay? So, and hence, what follows from that, because God's free to refrain from creating anything distinct from God, it follows that God could have existed alone. That is to say, it's possible that God exists and nothing apart from God exists. That's all that we're saying. There's some possibility, there's some scenario where that could happen. And so this basically is something that we cite a lot of different scholars in our paper on, and it's pretty unanimously held in the models of God literature and so on, that this is a pretty core commitment of classical theism. Now, I should note that we do make use of possible world semantics. So we talk about possible worlds. God could exist in a world in which God is not accompanied by creatures. We call that an alone world. So it's a world in which God and God alone exists, nothing else. And so we are talking about possible worlds and so on. I should note, though, that that's just a heuristic device, right? We're not like quantifying over them and saying that these things really exist out there as these weird like concrete universes or whatever. Like we're not saying that. It's just a heuristic device. It's what we mean by that is just a possible world is just a total or complete or global way that reality could be. Okay, so we're not saying that these like, oh, they exist out there as some spooky entities or God's like located in them and he's subordinate to them. No, we're not saying that. We're just using this as a heuristic device to make it easier to talk about possibilities. And the second thing that I want to say on this possible world semantics thing is that everything we say in the paper can actually be cast in terms that make no reference whatsoever to possible worlds, but instead only use like possibility and necessity operators. So that's just saying possibly such and such is the case, or necessarily such and such is the case. That doesn't make use of possible worlds at all. We're just saying the way that reality must be, or the way that reality could be. And so we can do that. And in fact, our step-by-step argument that we give in there, you only uses such operators. And so it has nothing to do with the whole framework of possible worlds. So people who have objections to possible world semantics or any other things like that, that's tangential to the argument. It's completely tangential. Okay, that's what I wanted to say.
Yeah, no, that's great. I appreciate that. And I think this next part is like where the argument might get a little more heavy, and it's this idea of like intrinsic divine knowledge. So like buckle up, it's going to get a lot of fun here. Can you talk about like what is intrinsic divine knowledge? Maybe you want to talk about like other ideas of divine knowledge, like what role is this going to play in your argument?
Yeah, so basically, let's start simple. Okay, so God knows a lot of things, right? God knows a lot of things. He knows that 1 + 1 = 2. Now, because 1 + 1 = 2, because that's a necessary truth, right? God necessarily has that knowledge. Okay, so in every possible world you look at, God knows that 1 + 1 = 2. He necessarily has that knowledge. But other things aren't like 1 + 1 = 2, right? Other things are such that God only contingently knows them. Okay, for instance, it's only contingently true that I exist, right? I could have failed to exist if my parents never met, say. And so God only contingently has the knowledge that I exist, right? If we focus on another world, another possible world in which I don't exist, well, then obviously God doesn't know in that world that I exist. I don't even exist in that world for him to know that, right? It's not even true. And so, yeah, knowledge presupposes truth. Everyone knows this. Knowledge is something like justified true belief, but, you know, obviously you get complications there with Gettier cases, but everyone agrees that knowledge requires truth. You can't know something that's false. You know, it's like, oh, I know that 1 + 1 = 5. It's like, what are you talking about? That just doesn't make any sense. So since knowledge presupposes truth, and since some things are contingently true, and since God knows everything in every world, God's going to have contingent knowledge in each world that we focus on. For instance, God's going to know for any creature X whether or not he created X in that world. And that's going to be some contingent knowledge that God only contingently has, because in some worlds the creature exists, in other worlds the creature doesn't exist. Okay, so God's knowledge that I exist, that's what we're talking about, that is contingent. But a problem arises here, right? So if this knowledge is intrinsic to God, so if this knowledge is like within God, right? Well, then there's something that's both contingent and intrinsic to God. But in that case, right, it's false that everything in God is identical to God. Because God can't be identical to like a contingent being. He can't be identical to something that's contingent. And so classical theists like W. Matthews Grant and Alexander Pruss and others, they make God's contingent knowledge extrinsic to God. So in other words, God's contingent knowledge, at least in part, consists in contingent realities themselves, which are outside of God. And so the contingent knowledge doesn't correspond to anything contingent in God, but rather the contingency is located outside of God on these views. Because if they located it inside of God, then that would just be a violation of divine simplicity. There would be something in God that is not identical to God because it's contingent. So that's kind of the role of intrinsic divine knowledge in the argument, and especially intrinsic contingent knowledge. Now, basically, what we do with that is that we try to show that this extrinsic model won't work at least for a world in which God exists alone. And if that model doesn't work, well, then there's something both contingent and intrinsic to God, because it's not going to be able to be extrinsic to God. And so our goal in the paper is basically just to argue that, at least in the alone world, there's going to be some sort of contingently obtaining reality, and it can't be outside of God because God doesn't create anything in the alone world. And so it must be in God, but that's not compatible with divine simplicity. So that's a basic role. I know where I'm going to flesh out the argument a little bit further later on, but and yeah, anyway, that's enough by way of now.
Yeah. No, do you think you can just like flesh out a little bit more? Like, why is this like God containing contingent knowledge, or obtaining contingent knowledge? Why is this bad for classical theism? Just in case maybe someone's not familiar with like what's going on here.
Yeah. So I was hinting at it there at the end, but I'm glad you like explicitly asked about it, so I can kind of lay out the scheme, as it were. So I'm not going to formalize it and lay it out here. I've learned from experience that that's not fruitful. It gets really technical. It's got a bunch of different necessity and possibility operators. It's like 11 premises long. I've learned from experience that it is not a good idea there are too many working parts to lay it out formally. So We're just going to take the informal route. That's how I'm gonna articulate it. So remember that according to classical theism, right, anything distinct from God, if it is to exist, requires God to create it. And God is free to create or refrain from creating, right? And so from that it follows, as we saw earlier, that God could exist alone without anything distinct from God. But now let's consider that possible world, or that possible state in which God does in fact exist alone. So in such a state, right, God's omniscient. God's essentially omniscient, so obviously in this state he's omniscient. So God knows in this state that 1 + 1 = 2, that God freely chose not to create, yada, yada, yada. He knows all these sorts of things. He knows that there are no dogs, and so on. Now, some of these truths or facts are such that God necessarily knows them, as we saw earlier. God necessarily knows that 1 + 1 = 2. God necessarily knows the Pythagorean theorem, and so on. But some of them are such that God only contingently knows them, right? God only contingently knows in such a state that there are no dogs, that he freely chose not to create, and so on. And so some of God's knowledge in such a state is contingent. So the argument goes. But now that's where the problem starts to arise, right? In such a state, in this possible world, the contingent knowledge is either in God, or outside of God. But it could be outside of God in such a state, since there's nothing outside of God in such a state, right? There's literally zilch outside of God in such a state. So it can't be outside of God. It's a state wherein God is alone. There's nothing outside God. And so the contingent knowledge is in God. But that means that there's something that is in God that is identical to God in this world, and yet it's contingent, right? So we found that there's something that's one, contingent, and two, in God. And that's just not compatible with divine simplicity, so we argue. Remember, all that is in God is identical to God. And God can't be identical to something contingent, right? God's not a contingent being. And so, since divine simplicity entails that the knowledge couldn't be in God in such a state, and yet we just concluded that, well, it actually is in God in such a state, it follows by the argument, if the argument succeeds, that divine simplicity is false. Now, like I said, there are lots of different moving parts. We go through a number of different objections in our paper. I've conversed with other people, and they have certain other objections. Now, I tend to think that some of those actually end up doing more harm than good, and end up biting certain bullets, and perhaps even end up being incompatible with classical theism on other fronts. But that's how the argument goes in a nutshell. So,
yeah, I think that's a great way of kind of moving forward. What are some of the I'm curious, like, what are some of the bullets you think some people might have to bite, like if they're classical theists? Before we get into like specific like, objections and such, like what bullets are possible that people might have to bite if they kind of like run with this argument?
Yeah, well, one of them could be that, well, let's see, which one do I want to take first? One of them is that someone might try to say that God's contingent knowledge in this world consists in God's knowledge that there are no dogs. Let's focus on that. Perhaps God just has an intrinsic state which is necessary, and perhaps we just predicate of this state something that is contingently true of that state, but the contingency is explained by the contingent absence of dogs, say. So that they might try to say that. So perhaps the contingency of God's knowledge in this alone world just consists in the absence of there being creatures, perhaps in conjunction with God's intrinsic necessary state, or perhaps we can get some kind of truth maker version where absences are serving as truth makers, and so on and so on. Now, what's difficult about that is that, well, firstly, we're getting into difficulties about, like, there are no such things as absences, so it's hard to see how absences could serve as an explanation. Like, usually we think if we're citing something to explain another thing, we normally don't think that we can cite something that doesn't exist. Like if I try to explain why, like the dog barked, and I try to cite fairies, like fairies don't exist. So it's weird that we would be able to cite fairies to explain that. But moreover, you can get worries about whether or not this has a truth maker and so on. So you get into deep weeds there, and you get into some pretty implausible views, arguably. But secondly, and this is another thing that I think is a bullet to bite, is like, not all of God's knowledge in this state is knowledge of absences. Like, there are no dogs. Like, okay, fine, that's an absence. And maybe we could grant classical theists that, okay, maybe we can grant them a story on which God's contingent knowledge consists in, or perhaps is explained by, the absence of dogs. But that's not the case for all of God's contingent knowledge in the alone world. Why? Well, because God knows that he freely chose not to create. That's knowledge of God's free choice. That's not knowledge of some absence. That's knowledge of God's providential, fully rational, informed, free choice. His choice. We're not talking about, oh, there aren't dogs or something. Now, what they might say then is like, okay, well, this choice itself, right? That's only a contingent choice to refrain from creating because in virtue of the absence of creatures, right? That's why we can predicate of this single act that it is a free choice to refrain from creating, because there aren't any creatures that accompany God. But then that seems to get the order of explanation backward, right? I mean, surely there are no creatures. Surely there's an absence of creatures precisely because the choice itself is a choice to refrain from creating. It's not a choice to refrain from creating because there are no creatures. So it seems to get the order of explanation wrong. So it's like, even if I granted them that they can get out of this thing by appealing to absences of dogs, say, or what have you, it seems as though they run into difficulties with focusing on God's knowledge of non-negative existentials and his knowledge of things that aren't absences, because then we can focus on God's knowledge of his contingent choice to refrain from creating, and then they're going to say, oh, well, that choice, there's no contingent reality to that choice. Rather, that's an extrinsic contingent predication of that choice. But then it seems that they're getting, the order of explanation wrong. It should be a choice to refrain from creating, not in virtue of there being no creatures. It's the other way around. So, obviously we can get into a lot more details there. I think there are other bullets that might potentially arise. But that's one example. I just wanted to give you an example, and I didn't explain it perfectly, but yeah.
No, that's great. I appreciate it. One thing that might be helpful here is I had this question for you of how would you explain the aloneness argument to a 5-year-old? So maybe we can up that to like a 10-year-old if need be. But like, how would you like basically explain the aloneness argument? Because it can be tricky to try to like get your mind around it. I'm still trying to figure it all out. So yeah.
Yeah, and I don't blame anyone at all for that, because like I said, there are so many different working parts, and yeah, it's difficult stuff. And yeah, like I said, I think we all need to have requisite epistemic humility here and not, claim triumphal victory and whatnot, and be open to being wrong and whatnot. So I would say to a 5-year-old or maybe a 10-year-old, if classical theism is true, well, then God could have refrained from creating anything else, right? Because God's free. He's free to create. So God could have refrained from creating anything apart from himself. So if classical theism is true, God could have existed all by himself, right? If he's free to refrain from creating anything apart from himself, well, then God could have existed all by himself. So if God could have existed all by himself, well, now let's consider that state where God, that possible state where God exists all by himself. In that state, right, the only thing in existence is God, who is utterly necessary, right? Yeah. So there's no contingency whatsoever. There's nothing that obtains, but that could fail to obtain, or that exists, but that could fail to exist. So there's no contingency whatsoever of any kind in this state that we're considering. Mm-hmm. So if classical theism is true, then in such a lonely state, in a state in which God is alone, well, then nothing is contingent. But plausibly, something is contingent in that state, right? Like God's knowledge that he's alone, or the contents of God's knowledge. Okay, so like maybe God's act of knowledge is necessary, but the contents are not necessary. Well, then focus on the contents. Maybe the contents are contingent, or whatever. Or maybe there's a contingent property of truth had by certain contents of knowledge, or whatever. So there seems to be something contingent here. But under classical theism, there couldn't be anything contingent there, because God and only God is existing in that world. And so by modus tollens, I probably shouldn't say that because they're a 10-year-old, but so that's the basic argument against classical theism for a 5 or 10-year-old. Yeah,
that's super helpful. So what think would be good to go into now is just like some objections to like the aloneness argument. There's a few different things here that we had drawn up, and one is can't things just have like extrinsic features in an alone world?
Yeah, so this is the first objection that we consider, and I should alert people to a few things. So firstly, you guys can check out the paper itself. That's the first thing that you can consider and check out for this. It's on my like Phil People profile. If you just search philpapers.org, and then you can just type in Joseph C. Schmid, and then you'll be able to find my Phil Papers profile or Phil People profile, and you can click on my name and you can get a free version there. So that's one thing that you should check out. I'm saying this as a preliminary because this objection comes up elsewhere. So we address that in the paper. Secondly, people can check out the video made by the YouTube channel called Intellectual Conservatism, where they criticize this argument. And I'm all for criticism and whatnot. I think it's beautiful. I think we're probing these deep questions together. Mm-hmm. So check out that video. And then thirdly, I check out my blog post response to that video, at my blog, majestyofreason.wordpress.com. And yeah, so I respond. It's part 1 out of part 2. I haven't made the part 2 yet. I'm extremely busy. Maybe I'll make a part 2. Hopefully at some point in the future. I don't know when, but hopefully I'll be able to make a part 2. But I'm just drowning in work with other sorts of things that I have to do. But yeah, those 3 things, and this objection comes up there. And so there's a lot to say about this objection. There's too much to say for present purposes. But like, what I'll say is this. Yes, things can have extrinsic features, or at least contingently satisfy certain predicates in worlds in which those things exist alone. So consider, for instance, the property or the predicate. Let's just focus on properties, because predicates, that makes things complicated. You can construe this in a kind of realist way or an anti-realist way. A realist would say things can have a property of, for instance, existing alone. Anti-realists or nominalists like William Lane Craig would say, no, like hiss at that. No, rather they just satisfy predicates. There's no property here. So we can talk about the predicate exists alone, or the property of existing alone. Let's just focus on the property, but I want to be neutral on those. So yeah, things can have extrinsic properties in worlds in which they exist alone. So for instance, the property of existing alone, that is an extrinsic property. It doesn't characterize something in virtue the way it is in and of itself. It characterizes it as it is, like as other things are, as reality as a whole is, namely that this thing isn't accompanied by other things. That doesn't have anything to do with how I am intrinsically, how I am in and of myself, within myself. Rather, that characterizes me in virtue of there not being other things, right? So that's a kind of extrinsic predication, and in particular, now we can get into a distinction. So, and the distinction that we draw in response to this is that we don't think this avoids the aloneness argument for a number of reasons. One reason, which this is the only one that I'll give right here, is that we can distinguish between what we in the paper call positive extrinsic properties and negative extrinsic properties. So a negative extrinsic property is just, it's something like it reports of its subject that the subject fails to be related to something else, or that, it's some kind of absence or failure or lack on the part of the subject. So consider that property of existing alone, right? Well, that reports of me that I fail to be related to other things. It reports of me a lack, that I lack relations to other things that might exist, that might accompany me. And so these negative extrinsic properties characterize things as they fail to relate to other things. But by contrast, positive extrinsic properties don't do that. Rather, there are some kind of positive reality in and of themselves. Perhaps they characterize things in virtue of the way that they relate to other things, or whatever. But they're non-negative extrinsic properties. So negative extrinsic properties report of their subjects some kind of failure or lack. Whereas positive extrinsic properties are just all those properties that aren't negative extrinsic properties. But with that in mind, we argue that it seems really implausible to say that God's knowledge is some kind of failure or absence or lack. To be sure, God may have knowledge that there is an absence or a lack or a failure. So he might have knowledge that there are no creatures or what have you. But that's crucially different from saying that the knowledge itself is an absence or a lack or a failure. And so God's contingent knowledge, we argue, is not going to be able to be a negative extrinsic property or negative extrinsic predication, since that doesn't seem to be reporting a lack or an absence or a failure on God's part. Rather, it seems to report some kind of positive reality, namely some like bit of knowledge, say. And in that case, it seems we're still left with some kind of contingent positive reality in the alone world. And since there are no contingent positive realities outside of God in the alone world, it seems as though it's going to have to be a contingent positive reality in God. Now, I guess, suppose that one disagrees with us there and thinks that, okay, God's knowledge of various absences or lacks, for example, of there being no creatures. Suppose that they think that, okay, that's still not some positive reality that is contingent, or else if it is some positive reality, it counts as contingent knowledge of an absence in virtue of the absence itself, and hence only extrinsically contingent. It's only extrinsically contingent, not intrinsically. Even still, I think we can focus, like I said earlier. So this goes back to one of the things that I was, when you asked about the bullets to bite. Even still, I think we can focus on God's knowledge, not of lacks or absences, but rather of God's own choice to refrain from creating, right? That choice surely is not some absence or lack. like it's not absence, it's not a knowledge of the absence of creatures or the absence of some other sort of thing. It's rather knowledge of a choice God made. Now, the classical theist might respond by saying, well, that choice itself counts as a choice to refrain from creating in virtue of the absence of creatures. And so ultimately, the only contingency here is extrinsic, right? The predication of God's act, that it is a choice to refrain from creating. Well, that's true not in virtue of anything intrinsic to God or that act, but rather that's true of the act contingently in virtue of the absence of creatures. But then, that brings up the problem that I raised earlier. It seems to just get the order of explanation wrong, right? I mean, it's not, it just seems, I don't know, God's choice doesn't count as a choice to refrain from creating in virtue of an absence of creatures. Rather, there's an absence of creatures in virtue of God's choice being a choice to refrain from creating, right? It's not the absence of creatures that determines that God's choice is a choice to refrain from creating. Rather, it's the other way around, right? It's the fact that God's choice is a choice to refrain from creating, which determines the absence of creatures. And so I don't think that this particular response will work to the original reply that I made. So that's a long-winded way of saying that I think that this objection, while valuable, doesn't quite work, at least by my lights and from where I stand right now. And I will say that there are other modes of criticism available with respect to this particular objection. Actually, this is where I wanted to bring up some new arguments that I've been thinking about. And in particular, so suppose that they want to say, God's knowledge that there are no dogs, that's a contingent extrinsic predication or whatever in the alone world, because God fails to be related to dogs, and perhaps it's in virtue of that failure that God has this knowledge or what have you, or that we can contingently predicate of this knowledge, that it is knowledge that there are no dogs. Suppose that they say that, then I want to say, well, hold on a second. Let's focus on the state prior to creation. So traditionally, classical theists hold to creation ex nihilo. That's one thing, among others, that demarcates them from panentheism, is this doctrine of creation ex nihilo. And as Ryan Mullins, John of Damascus, also Maimonides, Sam Liebens, all these sorts of thinkers point out, arguably the doctrine of creation ex nihilo has as a core commitment that there is this state of affairs. There's this state wherein God exists alone, causally prior. We're not saying it's temporally prior. I mean, obviously, God is timeless. So it's causally prior to the beginning of the universe, in which God alone exists, and there are no creatures. And of course, then there's a state in which God exists with creatures. But you can find all sorts of different thinkers, like Augustine, saying it is repugnant that creatures could be co-eternal with God. Creatures were not always, but God was always. And so there's a state where God is without creatures. And so that seems to be just a core commitment of creation ex nihilo. And I have boatloads of citations for that if people want. But so let's focus on that causally prior state, right? Let's focus on this state wherein God alone exists causally prior to creating things. And let's focus on this world's causally initial state where God is alone prior to creation. In that state, there is an absence of dogs, right? There's an absence of dogs. But yet, in that state, God still knows that, for instance, there will be dogs in a causally posterior state of reality. And so, in virtue of how does that knowledge characterize him? Because that's contingent knowledge. But there isn't anything extrinsic to God in this causally prior state because he's alone. And secondly, I mean, you can't cite the absence, right? I mean, the absence, that's supposed to be undergirding God's knowledge that there are no dogs simpliciter, but we're talking about God's knowledge that there actually will be dogs in the future, say. And so it seems as though they can't cite this absence in this causally prior state. And so that seems to be a predicament for the classical theists. Now, there are ways to formalize this, and I'm doing this off the top of my head, people, and I have a document that I'm working on where I kind of flesh this out, make it a little bit more rigorous. I use technical concepts like intrinsicality and extrinsicality and formalize what this prior state consists in and so on. But it does point to, I think, another interesting response to this objection that absences probably won't be able to save you, because there's also an absence of dogs, say, in the alone world, but there's also an absence of dogs in this causally prior state in which God exists alone. And yet somehow in one of them, God knows that there will be dogs at a causally posterior state, and then in another one, he doesn't know that. And so you can't just cite the absence as that in virtue of which the contingent knowledge applies. And again, some people might say, oh, well, in one of the states, God contingently intends to bring about creatures. But it's like you have to recognize that on classical theism, right, all of God's intentions are utterly necessary. And so we have to ask about this contingent. We're just predicating another contingent thing of God. In virtue of what is this contingent intention true in this state? And there's nothing extrinsic to God in this causally prior state. And so we can just run the same arguments there. But anyway, we're getting ahead of myself. I hope that suffices by way of response.
Yeah, I think that's great. We do have about 10 minutes left in terms of objections here, and then we'll get a little bit of audience Q&A for the end. But my next objection here, I'm just going to skip ahead a minute, is just, couldn't God just necessarily know like non-existent things, even though he doesn't actualize that possible world? Like per se, like, like God knows in like this world, maybe there's dogs, and another world there's maybe aliens running around, but he just doesn't actualize that world. But he knows that world's there. So then there's not really an issue here with regards to like the aloneness argument. So what are your thoughts there, Joe?
Yeah, so I didn't write too much in my notes by way of response to this. And so I agree that, yeah, God does know the contents of every possible world in each. So in any individual world, in that world, God knows all the contents of the other worlds. Yes, he knows like that if those worlds were actual, then such and such creatures would obtain. So, but that's necessary knowledge. That's knowledge about the modal space, about what is possible, and what's possible is necessarily possible per the S5 axiom of modal logic. So that's necessary knowledge, though, right? But the problem with this response, though, is that it doesn't avoid the aloneness argument, right? In the alone world, God might necessarily know some truths about non-existent things, right? He'll know that all dogs are dogs, and that in another possible world where there are dogs, there are such and such dogs in that world. So you might know that kind of knowledge, but and this is crucial to recognize some truths about these non-existent things are contingent, right? For instance, it's only contingently the case in the alone world that there are no dogs. It's only contingently the case that humans don't exist, and so on. And so God only contingently knows these truths in the alone world. So I don't quite think that that this response will just be able to avoid the aloneness argument, just because, like, yeah, we can grant that God knows all the contents of all the possible worlds, but that's just necessary knowledge. There's still the further contingent fact of which particular world happens to obtain. And that's going to involve a whole host of contingent propositions and contingent facts. God's going to have to know those. And because knowledge presupposes truth, God's only going to contingently know those, because it's only contingently the case that there are no dogs. So he's only going to contingently know that there are no dogs. It's not like God in this world knows that there are no dogs. There are dogs. God does not know in this world that there are no dogs, because that's not even true. And so, but yet in another world, God does know that there are no dogs, namely in a world in which he doesn't create them. So I don't think this response really sufficiently addresses the aloneness argument. So that's what I'd say.
Yeah, that's super interesting. The last objection I have for you here is like, what if the classical theist just like accepts a modal collapse? Like, obviously it's not super common, but maybe some people will and say, well, okay, there's a modal collapse, and then yeah, this just solves the issue. So what do you thought there, Joe? Yeah.
So one thing that I want to say is, well, so Ryan added this line to the paper. I didn't add this line to the paper, but Ryan said, in response to one objection that we came across, which is like a more restricted modal collapse, but basically similar to what you're saying here, he said, yeah, I mean, you might be able to take that route, but only at the cost of denying classical theism. And in general, he said, in general, we don't advise defending classical theism by way of denying classical theism. So I thought that was funny, and I'm like, okay, I'll leave it in there. You can have your cake, Ryan. So yeah, he put that in there. I thought it was funny, but yeah, traditionally that's my main response. Traditionally, classical theists, no, that's not okay. The modal collapse, like, it's part and parcel of classical theism that God is free to create or refrain from creating. I mean, I can go on and on about all the authors that I want to cite, but like, it's just a fact that this is pretty much the core of classical theism for like millennia, basically. But people could deny it, so let's just. Maybe someone's just going to dig their heels and be like, screw the tradition, I don't care, modal collapse, we're just going to take it, bada bing, bada boom. Now, that probably arguably would solve a lot of different problems, potentially for classical theism, but I think there are a lot of problems that in and of itself engenders, right? So I'm just going to briefly, I wrote these down because I didn't want to forget them. I have 8 problems that might accrue to someone who wants to accept modal collapse. So the first one, well, I already said that. It's traditionally a core commitment that God is free. But, secondly is perfect being theism, right? So we might think plausibly and intuitively that a being which is free to create or not create is better, right? It's better than one which is necessitated or compelled to create. The former, like a being that's free to create or not create, seems to come with a kind of control and artistic creativity and a kind of gift-givingness that's lost in a view on which God is necessitated or compelled to create. And so it might be a theoretical cost, seems intuitively to be a theoretical cost for one's view of God to adopt this kind of modal collapse. The third thing that I want to say, so the first one was that it's a traditional commitment of classical theism. Second thing is perfect being theism. The third thing is divine providence, so God's control, right? If God's necessitated or compelled to create and create exactly this world, I mean, it seems God's losing his providential control over creation, right? I mean, like over whether it obtains and if it does obtain its precise character, right? Like he doesn't have control over the contents and character of creation if it's absolutely necessary that he causally bring about this specific creation. Like when we say that I have control over, for instance, what my painting will be and what it will be like we mean that I can decide out of a range of options what to put in my painting and indeed whether I want to paint it and how to paint it and when to paint it and so on. But if we take all of those away, I have no control over what I paint, whether I paint it, how I paint it, when I paint it. I don't have control over my painting. Just you tell that to a painter and they're going to be like, what the heck? You took away my control. So it just seems to wreck divine providence. Fourth is natural theology. So, if we say creation exists of necessity, you're collapsing a lot of contingency arguments because one of the fundamental pieces of data upon which those arguments rest is that, well, hey, things are contingent. They could have failed to exist. And so that's what calls out for some deeper explanation, yada, yada, yada. But you just completely destroy some of the best arguments for God's existence if you take that away, arguably. So that's the fourth thing. The fifth thing is God's grace. So grace seems, by definition, to be a gift that need not have been given, right? I'm pretty sure even grace comes from the word gratuitous. And gratuitous just means needless. It need not be given, right? It's gratuitous. And so, we thank God in part for his giving us graces that we don't deserve and needn't have received. And so it strongly seems upon reflection that our concept of grace and gratuitous, that grace is by definition a gift that need not have been given. And so if you accept modal collapse, there's no such thing as God's grace. And that just destroys a lot of what we want. So that's if you say there's no such thing as God's grace. So that's the fifth thing. The sixth thing is human freedom. So many people, I'm agnostic on the debate, but many people find compatibilism about freedom implausible. But modal collapse would have to adopt compatibilism. Unless they want to say that we're totally unfree, but that doesn't work with hell and heaven and all those other sorts of things. But we could set that aside. So many find compatibilism about freedom really implausible, right? Many think that if everything we do is done of metaphysical necessity, such that we literally couldn't have done otherwise ever at all in no circumstances, then we simply aren't free. But obviously we are free, and so modal collapse is false. So you can run this argument as follows. You could say premise one: if someone ought to do something, well, then they can do that thing, right? Ought implies can. In other words, if one cannot do something, well, then surely it's not the case that you ought to do it, right? If I can't fly, what the hell would you mean when you say, oh, Joe, you should be flying? It's what? I can't fly. So, that's the proper response. I can't fly. What are you talking about? So arguably ought implies can. But for some people, they ought not to have done something that they in fact did. Or they ought to have done something that they didn't in fact do. So for those who disagree, just think about Hitler. Hitler did not refrain from killing millions, but he should have. He really should have. I think that's pretty obvious. So from those two premises, that ought implies can, and that Hitler did something that he ought not have, it follows that Hitler could have done otherwise, but that's incompatible with modal collapse. Okay, now obviously compatibilists aren't going to like that argument, and there are responses to that in the literature and so on, and responses to those responses, blah, 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 blah. Okay, so we're just going to move on. People, I know you might be peeing your pants, but that's okay. We're just going to move on. The seventh response that I want to make is just a Morian shift, right? It just seems obvious that there is some contingency, right? So throughout this discussion, I presume that I blinked nobody count, but if I'm presumed that I blinked, what have we been going for 45 minutes.
45 minutes. So probably 10 times?
How many times does someone blink in a minute? Yeah, let's just assume that in a minute someone blinks 10 times, okay? So now we've got 45 minutes going. That's 450 times I blinked. I think I could have blinked 451 times or 449 times. That seems obvious. Or I'm moving my finger. Can I like move it one more time? Like, surely I could do that, right? Like, that just seems obvious. So any view which entails that I can't do that, or that I couldn't have blinked 459 times or whatever, 449, I think that's just obviously wrong, and that's a Moorian shift. Okay, so that's the seventh reason, and then this is the final thing I'll say. The eighth reason is from divine dependence. So this is from James Dolezal. He says that, well, if God must create, well, then God's being the thing he is seems to require the existence of something apart from God, which seems in turn to make God in some sense dependent on creation to be fully himself, to be fully actual. And so according to Dolezal, a necessary creation is just incompatible with what he calls divine absoluteness, right? Like, if God must create, well then, I don't know, in some sense, in order to be God, there has to be something else. Like God would somehow need something apart from God to be God, because it's essential to him that he creates. So it's like he doesn't seem to have this kind of requisite absoluteness that we want of God and that traditionally is asserted of God. So those are 8 different reasons why we shouldn't think, or at least under classical theism, why modal collapse would be disastrous. And most people in the modal collapse debate accept that. There are some who don't. Like Catherine Rogers, for instance, she just accepts modal collapse. She's a classical theist. But yeah.
Yeah, that's super helpful, and I appreciate you kind of walking through those objections and like the 8-step plan to destroying the modal collapse objection. That's great. We'll go to a little bit of Q&A here. Jono says, if Joe accepts the Prue-Malpass view of possibility, I guess that's like the S5 like modality, could this be used to object to the idea that an alone world is possible?
Yeah, so I definitely lean towards that view of modality. So for people who don't know, this is a kind of Aristotelian view of modality. Broadly Aristotelian. It's kind of like a branching view where things are possible in virtue of either being actual or being grounded in the actual causal powers of things. So things having the causal power to initiate a causal chain leading up to the thing in question. Concrete things, that is. And so it's this kind of branching view of modality where every possible world, if it is to be possible, has to share a history, a causal history with the actual world. Now, I don't think that could be used. Oh, and I should say that Proust defends this in one of his 2011 books. That's actually what convinced me that this is probably true. Malpass defends it. Oppie defends it. Josh Rasmussen has sympathies with it. He also has sympathies with a Platonic view of modality. But, I think I already said, I don't know if I already said Rob Koons, but like Rob Koons, a lot of people, a lot of respected philosophers. So I'm not alone. But my point here is just that I don't think that this can be used as an objection to the idea that an alone world is possible, because under classical theism, right, that initial causal segment is God himself, and it's grounded in the causal powers of God himself that God could have chosen not to create. And so one of the possible outworkings of God's own causal power is indeed a world in which God chooses to refrain from creating, and that would be an alone world. So that's a possible outworking of causal powers, and so that is indeed one branch that reality could have gone down. So I don't think this wouldn't be able to be used to object to the idea of an alone world being impossible, at least if you have classical theism, because classical theism has the requisite causal power to bring that about.
Susan says, what about the Trinity? Does this mess up the objections to God in the aloneness world? This is interesting because it's like, I'm trying to think about how you could like phrase this objection. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts, Joe? Maybe like one Trinity member is like, no, let's not create this world. Another guy's like, yeah, man, it's going to be pretty fun. But then it's like total Christian heresy, I'm sure. So I don't know what you're thinking.
I think Christians have to affirm that they have one will. I'm pretty sure.
That's at least in social Trinitarianism. I haven't studied like all the different like views of the Trinity though.
Yeah. Well, we should both probably say not as much stuff because we're going to say false. But anyway, I'm pretty sure Christians have to say that they have one will and one power. I think that's in one of the creeds. But anyway, we could set that aside. Some people reject like those things. But anyway, the question. That's an excellent question. Now, what I want to say is that that's still an alone world, right? I mean, like each of the members of the Trinity is God, right? You can't say that they're not God. So like there's still only one. There's still only God here, right? God's the only thing in the alone world. But it's a good question. And even supposing that there's more than, let's just say that there's more than one thing in the alone world. Let's just say that. It's a weird way of speaking, but there's more than one positive ontological item. Okay, that's a fine way of speaking. There's more than one positive ontological item. Still, I think the aloneness argument could go through because everything about the Trinitarian God of classical theism is still necessary, right? Each of the persons is necessary, and so on. Everything intrinsic to them is numerically identical to them, and so on. So, yeah, you still have everything necessary. And so you still have this question of how you're going to square contingent knowledge with that. And then you can, then we can run the Aloneness argument, then we can get into the objections from extrinsicality and, yeah.
Yeah, it's good. Daco says, is Zach a neoclassical theist? Nah, man, I'm a classical theist because I know that Joe is just trying to do these mental gymnastics to make it sound like God has parts, and and there's no difference between God and that hoodie in front of me. I saw your blog response to Proust. I don't know. I really don't know. I kind of like neoclassical theism, but I also kind of like some kinds of panentheism, but I don't like other kinds, and I don't know. It's kind of weird. So
I love panentheism. I think it's super cool because, I'm not saying that this argument succeeds, but it's interesting. Felipe Leon has an argument for material causality that, and material it's a rough word. He basically just means whenever there's stuff, it comes from some pre-existing stuff. It's made out of that. That naturally, and he has an argument for that, and he basically says that as an argument against creation ex nihilo. But the panentheist can accept that argument, right? The panentheist can say, absolutely, yeah. And, there's inductive evidence for that principle. There's Bayesian evidence and so on, but we don't need to get into that. My point is just that I think, panentheism is pretty respectable and so on. But yeah, and anyway.
Yeah, no, he is I enjoy listening to. It's interesting to think about his argument because it's a lot of fun and he makes good points. That's why I'm kind of attracted to the idea, we're kind of almost in God's mind in a sense, idealism, kind of panentheism, kind of like idealism. Because there's some panentheists, it's really weird because some are there is no pre-existing stuff. It seems like some of maybe the older ones, but then you have process theism where it's well there is this matter or something that exists. So I don't know. It's weird.
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of them say that God creates out of his own being, as it were, or some say that out of his own mental images and so on. And so you get the kind of view. And there are some actually really interesting, sophisticated defenses in the contemporary literature of idealism. But yeah, Josh Rasmussen himself has certain sympathies with it, so it's interesting. Yeah. But yeah, I guess I know he asked you about this, but I think. I don't think anyone should say that classical theism is irrational or utterly decisive, or debunked, or even that neoclassical theism is debunked or utterly decisive, or that it's irrational. I think we can recognize room for rational and reasonable disagreement, and there are considerations on both sides. I have 2 videos on my channel on arguments for classical theism. I go through, give some critical assessments of that, and so on. If people want to look into those, I also have. I'm also going to be making a 2 or 3 part. No, it's going to be 3-part series on just a survey of arguments against classical theism. And I'm obviously not going to be defending all of them. I'm actually going to be pretty critical of some of them and saying that, hey, this doesn't work, and the classical theist has good responses to this. So, but other ones, of course, I'm going to be defending and so on. But my point is just that, I think we should all have pretty more nuanced views about these things rather than saying oh, yours just makes God this. He's some Zeus character, or contrary-wise, you guys just have this ineffable, incoherent, doesn't make any sense. We could drop the polemics, we can try to, steel man another's views and so on. So.
No, I appreciate that, and I think we're progressing towards more steel manning versus just creating debunked videos and saying everyone else is rational. Jonas says what's the best advice, or what's Joe's advice for people wanting to start publishing papers as an undergrad?
Yeah. Okay. So, number 1 advice is find a mentor. So that's what I would say. If you're at a university, try to find one of your professors. Professors in philosophy or whatever you want to publish in. Find the professor. Say, hey, I'm interested in starting publishing. I have some interesting new ideas, and I think that they're novel in literature. But can you kind of help me work through this process? That's what I would really say. That's the biggest thing, because the professors, they are in the field. They know which journals are going to be most appropriate for you. They're going to be able to look at your paper that you're thinking of sending off for publication. They're going to be able to give some feedback. They're going to be able to tell you whether or not it's publishable. They're going to be able to just coach you through it. And once you get once you understand the workings of how to do that, with one time, then you'll be able to take off the training wheels, and you'll be able to do it yourself. So that's my number 1 advice. Try to find a mentor, whether it's a PhD student who has already published, preferably in their later years of the PhD, or a professor. That's better. The mentor. There are also things online about publishing in philosophy. So I can send this person. If they want to email me, I can send them some links to certain things on the internet that give some good advice. Yeah.
That's great. Well, Joe, I think that's about all the time we have. So, is there anything kind of like last thoughts, things you get to say before we wrap things up? Wait, before the conclusion. Last time this year we did a conversation around this time last year. I think it was in like August. And I asked you Arsenal predictions, and you said Arsenal was going to make top 4. I'm pretty sure they missed the UEFA Conference League, which is a new thing.
They were they were so close. So I remember the last day of the season. I was like watching the Tottenham game, Tottenham versus Leicester. So a lot of your listeners won't know this, but like this is like everyone is on the edge of their seats because Leicester might make the top. Leicester might make the top 4. Depends on the results. Tottenham might not even make any European league. And like I was at the edge of my seat, and Tottenham, of course, in the last like 10 minutes or so, scores like 2 goals or something. And that meant that Leicester, I think, went out of the top 4, which is sad. But it also meant that Tottenham finished above Arsenal. If Tottenham had lost, which they were on the track to doing for most of the game, Arsenal would have made European soccer. So they would have gotten like 6th or 7th, I forget, but they would have been pretty high up, and they would have finished above Tottenham. Anyway, I was so sad. But if you want my prediction for next season,
yeah, I'm ready.
Oh man, so I'm gonna go with either 6th or 7th. I'm gonna have faith. I'm gonna say 6th.
Europa League, at least. That should be Europa League.
Yeah,
man. What a season for Arsenal. That would be interesting. Hopefully they sign some Americans and maybe I'll have some reason to root for them.
Yeah.
But for now, I support Chelsea.
Chelsea. So like I don't support Chelsea, but I have to be honest. When I see Christian Pulisic, I'm like rooting for him. I hope he's
so much fun.
I'm so rooting for him every time I see him. So like I hope Chelsea loses. Chelsea loses 4-3, but Christian Pulisic gets the hat trick. So like that's what I would say.
I appreciate that. Yeah, Pulisic being from like I'm from State College. Hershey's like an hour away. It's like that's our guy.
Yeah,
like how can you not root for Pulisic?
That's so cool.
So, yeah. Well, Joe, thank you so much for joining me. Do you have any kind of like last thoughts, non-soccer related, before we wrap things up here with the Aloneness argument and such?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I don't think anyone should use this argument as like a weapon. And there also I think there might be certain ways that classical theists can respond. It's just I think that they're going to involve biting certain bullets. I don't think any argument is going to be able to prove some kind of conclusion with absolute certainty or what have you. I mean, some arguments, well, like Russell's paradox, like you can obviously show that there can't be a set of all non-self-membered sets and so on. But in the context of philosophy and respectable views on either side, you're probably not going to find such knockdown arguments. It's just what you have to do is look at the responses and see if they involve biting certain bullets. And what I would argue is that there are lots of bullets. I would argue that the classical theist would have to bite in order to successfully get out of the aloneness argument. So those are my thoughts right now. And I'm developing some new, like I said in the middle of our stream, I'm developing some new aloneness arguments as well. So people can stay posted for that. But yeah, thank you for having me on.
Yeah, it's been so much fun, Joe. Glad you joined us. And I encourage everyone, you can check out the Majesty of Reason YouTube channel. If you're listening on YouTube, it's like added, so you can just add it and go there. If you're listening via podcast, you can do something similar. But one last time, Joe, thank you so much. And Eduardo, Randolph, Jono, everyone else, thank you for tuning in. Have a good one, and bye, everyone.